In 2 days, 14 states and 1 territory across this country will be voting for a Democratic presidential candidate, and there are now 7, count 'em, candidates left heading into Super Tuesday. Many of them are hitting southern states today as they crisscross the country in a campaigning blitz. New polls are showing Bernie Sanders could have a very successful day on Tuesday as he is leading in Texas. Democrats are giving him 34% of the vote there. Joe Biden follows with 19. Then Michael Bloomberg coming in with 15%. Checking out North Carolina, Sanders is also in the lead with 26%. However, it's very close. Joe Biden is a close second with 24%. Biden, of course, coming off a huge night in South Carolina. NBC projecting he will win the state's primary. He currently holds 36 of those delegates, bringing his total now to 51. And here's where the other candidates stand with 99% of the results in. Bernie Sanders has 20%. Tom Steyer, who has since dropped out of the race, won 11%. Pete Buttigieg coming in with 8. Elizabeth Warren has 7, and Amy Klobuchar weighing in with 3%. Biden celebrating with hundreds of South Carolina supporters last night, and today he told NBC's Chuck Todd he has raised $5 million in the last 24 hours, and he thinks Sanders would lead the party to a loss if he were the nominee.
I think Bernie Sanders' position on a number of the issues, even in the Democratic Party, are going to be very controversial. The idea that you're going to find $60 billion and not going to raise $1 trillion, I should say, not going to have to raise taxes on middle-class people. Now everybody's going to look at Bernie's record as closely as they've looked at mine over the last 5 months, and I think they're going to see some stark differences in where we stand.
Senator Bernie Sanders sharing a much higher fundraising number, saying he raised over $46 million in the month of February.
It's not just that we're raising a lot of money. We are. It's how we are raising that money. It's $18.50 is our average contribution. That speaks to the kind of grassroots support we have in this country. Almost 2 million Americans have made that contribution.
Pete Buttigieg is in Georgia campaigning with former President Jimmy Carter. Also speaking to NBC's Chuck Todd, he acknowledged his lack of support within the black community.
That bar of earning the trust of voters of color right now, that bar is high for a reason, especially when you're talking about black voters in the South. I understand why that bar is so high. I'm humbled by the challenge and have continued to focus on making sure I present not just our policy ideas, but what this campaign is about in a way that can reach out to black voters and to voters across the board.
And Michael Bloomberg is in Selma, Alabama today, speaking about the importance of making change for the black community.
Too many times in our society, we promise things, we pass legislation which never gets funded, never gets implemented, and nobody ever checks to see whether we actually deliver the promise. I'm determined to make sure that does not happen.
Let's go straight to NBC News political reporter Vaughn Hilliard. He's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the heartland of America. So, Vaughn, with a welcome to you. So this race winnowed down a bit more last night. As we are heading into Super Tuesday now, what are candidates doing to secure their positions in the race?
Look, Alex, 14 states will be voting on Tuesday. 14 states. This is the single day in which the largest allotment of delegates will be handed out to candidates. And look, you saw Tom Steyer drop out last night, but you still have Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Michael Bloomberg. Everything Michael Bloomberg has put into this campaign, those hundreds of $1 million, it comes down to this moment. But you also see Pete Buttigieg sticking through this race, vowing to stick it through Super Tuesday. Our colleague, producer Brian, made a great map that, if we could pull it up, to kind of show the disbursement of these candidates. We wound up here in Oklahoma. We should note Pete Buttigieg will be here in the state tomorrow. Amy Klobuchar will also be in the state. Several of these candidates are starting off the day here in Selma, Alabama, first crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, of course, the location back of Bloody Sunday back in 1965. From there, the candidates will be heading across the country. Bernie Sanders will be holding rallies in San Jose and Los Angeles. Joe Biden will be heading up to Norfolk, Virginia. You have Pete Buttigieg holding a rally tonight in Dallas, and Michael Bloomberg over in San Antonio. Amy Klobuchar up to the north in her home state of Minneapolis. On Super Tuesday, these 14 states states, there are going to be delegates that are apportioned out based on statewide results. But then also there's a congressional delegate game at play. You can also win delegates by winning or hitting, I should say, a 15% threshold in a congressional district. And that's where several of these candidates, especially Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, are contending that they still have a chance at this, that they can keep Bernie Sanders at bay by performing it well in some of these congressional districts, in places like Tulsa, in places like Oklahoma City. And so that is where you're seeing these candidates squared up. I want to play for you a part of interviews this morning from Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders where they're talking about the future of their own campaigns.
The most important thing right now is to look at what we can do to make sure that we put forward a campaign that is going to end the Trump presidency.
Almost all of the national polls out there, you know, of the last 70 polls, 65 of them, I think, have us beating Trump. We're beating them in battleground states like Pennsylvania. Wisconsin beat Trump.
Bernie Sanders is making the play that he's the best equipped to beat Donald Trump, as you just heard. But the folks like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden believe that they should be a counter to Bernie Sanders. The question is, will Super Tuesday help clarify who that potential Bernie Sanders counter is, or does Bernie Sanders run away with this on Tuesday night, Alex?
That is absolutely the question. Thank you very much, Vaughn Hilliard from Tulsa. Joining me now, Kenesha Grant, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Howard University. Chris Liu, former Deputy Labor Secretary, and Susan Del Percio, MSNBC political analyst and Republican strategist. Welcome all. Kenesha, to you first here. So as we look at this new NBC polling, it's out of the state of North Carolina. It shows Bernie Sanders leading Joe Biden by just 2 points, certainly well within the margin of error. 7% of voters remain undecided. So how much do you think last night's huge win, just, you know, to the south there in South Carolina, moves the headwinds for Biden?
I think they're going to be incredibly important in moving those headwinds. I think that we have been hearing a campaign about Joe Biden as a person who is not viable, and increasingly hearing about Bernie Sanders as a person who is viable. And so now we have a little bit of trouble to that narrative. Now we have folks who might have been on the fence about Biden who might feel a bit more comfortable supporting him now. Now we might have some black voters who were worried about casting their vote for him and whether they should go to Mike Bloomberg, maybe choosing to stay in that camp instead of going somewhere else.
Interesting. Chris, let's move now west to another new NBC poll from Texas that shows Sanders. He's definitely got the lead there. He's got 34% rather at this point. Behind him, Biden with 19, Bloomberg coming in with 15. Are Bloomberg and Biden hurting each other's campaigns at this point? Are they drawing from the very same, more moderate pool of voters?
Yeah, I think that would be the easy conclusion to come with, and I think that's generally correct. I think the problem is people tend to pick their candidates based on personalities, based on positions. Yes, there's a moderate lane, there's a more progressive lane, but it's not as kind of a one-to-one trade-off. I will say this, I mean, last night was a huge night for Joe Biden, but he does have a little bit of a math problem right now. I mean, California is a state that looks like it's going to probably get away from him. He's going to actually have to rely on somebody like Elizabeth Warren to keep down some of Bernie Sanders' vote totals. Biden also goes into Super Tuesday while with a lot of momentum, without as much money and organization as some of his competitors have. And obviously, with just 2 days to go until Super Tuesday, it's hard to really translate that momentum into a lot of votes, particularly since so many people now vote early.
Yeah. Okay, Susan, since Chris started us down the math path, here we go. Tuesday, there are more than 1,300 delegates in play, 643 alone coming from California and Texas, the two biggest prizes there on Tuesday. Sanders, up until now, has led very much in both states, and this is to Chris's point. But what is the significance of that? I mean, he talked about how some moderates could split the vote, and how, you know, Biden, he's got to hope that Sanders gets somewhat buffeted by Elizabeth Warren. But big picture here, these two states represent what in your mind?
A lot of where everything's headed. The big question is does in California, who else can get up to 15% of the vote? Because in morning delegates, that's what's required. So Bernie Sanders could win as much as 300 if he cleans up and no one else gets 15%. What's interesting about the polls that we're seeing is that it's a 1, 2, 3. Bernie, Biden, and Bloomberg lineup right now. What's also interesting is Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren's probably preventing Bernie Sanders from hitting the high 30s, low 40s in some states. So if I were Joe Biden, I'd want Elizabeth Warren to stay in at least until the 17th. It will help him at least cut into some of Bernie Sanders' vote totals there. But what we learned last night from South Carolina so far, the only person to truly affect turnout and get large amount of people out is Joe Biden. He had tremendous turnout. This was 2008 numbers, not 2016 numbers. So that also hurts Bernie Sanders' argument that he could build a large coalition.
What do you think, Kenesha, is driving that turnout for Joe Biden?
I think that in South Carolina in particular, black voters are very important to this story, so I'd be interested to see what the demographic breakdown is going to be here. I think that people in South Carolina understood that this primary was moving in a way that was about to make Bernie Sanders the heir apparent. I think that folks in South Carolina probably didn't support that opinion, and so they understood that they needed to come out in large numbers. I think it's also the case that they understand that one of the big problems that we have in American democracy is that people don't turn out to vote. We have a large number of non-voters, and so I think that people there must have been giving them messages that not only were they important, but potentially some of the people who haven't participated in our democracy in the past also need to get out and participate in this primary election and probably the general.
But Kenesha, as you look at Sanders grabbing pretty much the bulk of headlines from the first 3 states, the caucuses and that one primary, and then you see Biden getting all the headlines out of South Carolina, do you see other states on this forthcoming Super Tuesday that will move in the Biden direction as a result of that huge win?
I'm really interested to see what's going to happen in Virginia and North Carolina. I think that Biden earlier alluded to this idea that we needed a Democratic Party candidate who was going to be able to win in the South, which suggests to me that he is probably making a play for the South, suggesting that maybe in the same way as Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams, he might be able to win a place like Florida and Georgia. And I think it's Super Tuesday that North Carolina and Virginia will send that warning signal about whether or not the South is up for grabs for Democrats.
Okay. I know we've all heard the growing concerns over the possibility that when the convention rolls around, none of the candidates has reached that majority of delegates that's needed to win the nomination. Bernie Sanders argued again this week that the candidate with the most delegates should win the nomination. Here's what he said about that.
If I or anybody else goes into the Democratic convention with a substantial plurality, I believe that individual, me or anybody else, should be the candidate of the Democratic Party. And if one candidate comes out on top to say to the country, you voted for that candidate, oh, but by the way, we don't think that candidate should be the nominee, I think that will be a serious, serious problem for the Democratic Party.
Chris, I just got to ask you, what are your thoughts on this? And do you find this approach annoying to Democrats?
Well, I have to tell you, I have a little bit of a personal interest in this since I am actually a superdelegate as well. Look, here's what I'm going to be looking for. I'm going to be looking, obviously, to see if anyone gets that 50% plus 1. But I'm also going to be looking at a candidate's ability to turn out new voters, their ability to garner the resources you need to win a race, as well as their strategy for beating Trump. But look, the rules are what they are. Unless you have 50% plus 1, you know, it's anyone's bet as to what happens after that. And so, look, we're a long way from that point right now. So my only message to people is go out and vote and don't prejudge what's going to happen down the road.
Let's get to a Reuters report, guys, because in 2016, when the superdelegates overwhelmingly endorsed the eventual nominee Hillary Clinton, Sanders supporters argued that system was unfair since those superdelegates were allowed to vote on the first ballot, and as a result, the DNC instituted new rules for this year. They have been backed by Sanders that now prevents superdelegates like you, Chris, from participating in the initial vote. So, you know, Chris, if Sanders backed the rules made for this year, can he criticize them? See room to do that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I was on the rules committee of the DNC that changed these rules, and I think it was an important change because we don't want superdelegates to be influencing the opinions while people are voting right now. But exactly right. We don't vote on the first ballot, but we can vote on the second ballot. And obviously, all pledged delegates to other candidates who might drop out after that point are also free to vote their own conscience. And so, but again, let's wait to see what happens in the next couple of months.
Okay, so I'm still going to ask this question. I'm not necessarily expecting an answer, but that is, Chris, if Sanders comes into the convention and he's got the plurality, would you push back against him to back a more moderate candidate?
I'm going to wait and see what happens till the convention.
That was a good answer. Yeah, didn't get much, but I didn't bet that I would. Yes.
Just to jump
Susan.
in there, I think there's a big difference if Sanders comes in 47, 48, 49% versus if he comes in at the high 30s or low 40s. I think that will be definitely a big consideration when you're looking at that. So we have to take that under consideration. The other thing is Bernie Sanders is the only candidate running for president who's had a say in the rules. So if anyone's going to try and cry foul, it could be the other candidates. Certainly Bernie Sanders is in no position to cry foul over them.
You know what, Chris, and then Kanisha, I'm going to ask you a question. But Chris, with regard to what she just said, that the place where Bernie Sanders were to come into the convention in Milwaukee, does that have an effect on how you would, whom you would back?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think what Susan says is right. I mean, if he is within a couple of percentage points of the majority and no one else is, much above, 15, 20%, it's going to be hard to deny him at that point. But I think, obviously, that margin is going to depend on what happens in these next couple of months.
Kanisha, the final question to you is, if Bernie Sanders were to be denied in that scenario that we've just played out at the convention, how much would it damage the Democratic Party?
I think it would. I spent a good bit of time this week reading a Knight Foundation study about non-voters, and the number one thing that non-voters say about why they don't vote is that they don't have trust in the system. I think that we have an American electorate that is worried and stressed out about Donald Trump and his administration and what it does. I think that we have people who are on the fence about voting, or maybe people who have never voted who think that the system is rigged, who think that it doesn't work. And I think that if Democratic Party leaders decide to buck the will of the people, even if the win is marginal, it is a win. And I think that if they decide to buck the will of the people, that won't bode well for the general election.
In other words, the people will have spoken. Kanisha Grant, Chris Liu, Susan Del Percio, good to see all three of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The administration today gave at least a partial explanation on why the president said the coronavirus victim was a woman when it actually was not. It was a man. You're going to hear it next. Back now with the breaking news on the latest strain of coronavirus and new reaction from the Trump administration to the first death and a suspected outbreak at a nursing home near Seattle. Washington state officials say the man in his 50s who died from coronavirus in that state had no recent travel overseas and that he was only tested when the CDC expanded testing guidelines last week. Well, today, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar said the CDC had no delays on testing, and he highlighted additional steps the administration has taken.
As of Wednesday, we authorized over 40 labs to use the test with only the first two elements of that, specific to the novel coronavirus. Yesterday morning, we've authorized home brew tests by certified clinical labs around the country. As I said, we now have the ability to test 75,000 people in the field at this moment, and that will increase radically over the next couple of weeks.
Now, administration officials also confirmed that a team from the Centers for Disease Control is now at that nursing home near Seattle where two women have tested positive for the virus. They say a large investigation is underway to find out exactly how that virus spread there. Let's go to the White House now. NBC's Hans Nichols standing by for us at his post. Hans, with a welcome to you on this Sunday. What more is the administration saying on this?
Well, the administration is clearly briefing and preparing the public for more infections, for more cases of coronavirus. That was consistent throughout the morning shows. You had that from Vice President. You had that from Secretary Azar. They also had to clean up this miscommunication yesterday where the White House offered condolences for a deceased 50-year-old female when, in fact, the first death from coronavirus was from a male. So they were cleaning that up. But what they're clearly trying to do is project proactivity while also trying to make sure that this doesn't turn into a panic. Have a listen to Secretary Azar.
The risk is low. It remains low, but we have always expected we would see more transmission. And as she predicted, we will see at least some limited community transmission. The president, though, is also trying to keep balance in messaging so that the American people don't engage in unwarranted panic.
Now, yesterday they warned about that new threat level, new travel level for people going to northern Italy. Essentially, don't do it, as well as parts of South Korea. They changed a little bit around direct visits from Iran, but that's been in place, and there are very few travelers that come directly from Iran to the States. The options they're considering going forward is whether or not to have more travel restrictions, and then also this idea of whether or not they'll use this Cold War-era law called the Defense Production Act that will kind of force the United States or force companies within the United States to produce more protective gear and equipment. That's something that they're clearly considering, and they hinted at that today. There's also a report in the Atlantic Journal-Constitution that President Donald Trump may be visiting or is planning on visiting the headquarters of the CDC in Atlanta later in the week. So clearly they want to project activity. They want to project that they're really taking this seriously. We had that press conference yesterday. And at the same time, after that press conference, the president went to a conservative rally just a little bit outside of Washington, and he did not repeat the hoax line that he used from Friday night after he was forced to explain it in that briefing here at the White House. Alex?
Okay, well, certainly lesson learned. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that, Hans Nichols. Let's go now to Kirkland, Washington, just northeast of Seattle, and that's where NBC correspondent Scott Cohn has moved from his post yesterday in Sacramento. Scott, today you're outside this hospital where the doctors are still treating that one coronavirus patient. Are officials any closer to figuring out how this virus spread in this nursing home in Kirkland?
Yeah, that is one of the key tasks, Alex, for the team from the Centers for Disease Control, which is now on the ground here in Washington, as well as the local public health officials. And just to orient you a little bit more, again, as you said, we're at the hospital in Kirkland, Washington, where that patient died yesterday. And there is a second patient that is at the facility in isolation. About a mile from here is the skilled nursing facility where they've confirmed 2 cases. One was a worker at the facility, a woman in her 40s, the other a resident, a woman in her 70s. There may be 50 or so other people who have been exposed and are being in the process of being tested. Some firefighters who had responded there are self-quarantined. So there is a lot going on, and a lot of that then springs from that first U.S. death announced yesterday, that man in his 50s who came here with severe respiratory symptoms. Secretary Azar says that alone is triggering an intense investigation.
Yeah. He was in a hospital. This hospital is one where the nursing home sends patients. There are cases in that nursing home also. So right now there's a large investigation going on, the nursing home, the hospital, contact tracing to try to determine where that disease was introduced and how it might have spread.
It's beyond, though, just figuring out where and how it was spread. The concern is that this has been spread in the community for possibly a matter of weeks. Remember, the first case of COVID-19 in the U.S. was here in Washington. It was someone who had traveled from China. And so the question is, how long has it been spread? How has it been spread? So they're also focusing on containment. So, for example, here at the hospital, they are encouraging people not to come and visit their loved ones. They've limited the points of access to the facilities. There's things like that going on, and just the continued tips about hygiene, washing your hands, avoiding a lot of contact with people, and so on. So a really multi-level approach going on here in the Seattle area. Alex?
All right. Well, thank you for the setup. We've got a doctor here who's going to talk about all of this with us, Scott Cohn, there in Kirkland, Washington. And joining me now is Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of California, Dr. Matthew Waxman. Okay, a couple things to get off of here with with regard to that nugget that he just gave us, that the first case was somebody in the state of Washington who traveled from China, okay? So is that a common sense presumption that maybe that person somehow has spread to a nursing home, which one would assume is a rather closed environment, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense that that virus would spring up from within that nursing home, right? Without some sort of a derivation.
No, Alex, it doesn't. So what people are working on right now is called shoe leather epidemiology. And what that means is they are trying to go back and find everybody in that nursing home that may have had contact with somebody who's been infected. What it tells us is that there is spread in the community. There are people in the community that currently may have coronavirus that are asymptomatic and they're spreading it. We sort of expected this. When the virus started in December in Wuhan, China, it was localized. It spread throughout China, and now we have local transmission in the United States.
And the fact that there are probably a number of cases of people who carry this virus, some you don't even have really, it's asymptomatic, right?
Exactly.
How concerning is that to be able to corral this and get rid of it, or contain it at least?
Yeah, so it is concerning to us. It's not unexpected, but it's concerning. It's concerning in the sense that we don't really know how many people are out there with coronavirus. We don't really know who's carrying it because not all these people are going to manifest symptoms. In the best data that we have, only about 2 to 3% got sick enough to be hospitalized and ultimately pass away from it.
So how does someone look at this and say, I may have this? What are the symptoms that you see, and how does it differentiate from the flu, or does it?
Yeah, so really, in some ways it does and it doesn't. It doesn't differ from the flu in that many patients have respiratory disease. They have weakness, cough, stuffy nose, a simple bronchitis. A small subset of patients, most of them have been elderly, some have been underlying sick, they develop a severe respiratory illness. And when they come into an emergency department like I work in, we test them for flu this time of year. And the CDC has revised its guidelines that if they're flu negative, like they don't have flu, and it's a severe respiratory disease, we're going to start thinking, could it be coronavirus?
I'm curious about the kind of testing that you have. Do you have all that you need and all that you anticipate needing right now in that emergency room where you work?
So in the setting that I work here in Los Angeles County, I feel like we do. We have testing, 1, for influenza, and 2, in conjunction with local health departments, we have access to coronavirus testing if we think somebody is a suspect.
And that would be something that you would send to the CDC, correct? Or do you have local ability
Currently,
to test?
in Los Angeles County, we now have local testing as of this week.
Okay. And Health and Human Service Secretary Alex Azar saying that there are going to be these portable test kits that are passed around. There will be an increase in the number of those. Any concerns about their reliability?
No concerns right now. Alex Azar also mentioned that there were going to be homebrew kits.
Right.
So and that doesn't mean people are making this at home. It means that outside non-government companies are going to be allowed to sell and develop testing kits.
Okay, so somebody has a cold, a runny nose, has a bit of a fever, does not believe there's any reason to think that they have come in contact with somebody who came from the Wuhan province in China, right? What should they do without being an alarmist?
Exactly. So right now, if you have mild disease, it is very unlikely in the United States for it to be coronavirus. The transmission rate is very, very low. We are not seeing people in the United States flooding to ERs and flooding to hospitals with respiratory illnesses. And if they do, they often usually have flu. People should stay home. They should wash their hands. Do what you normally would do. Take ibuprofen, acetaminophen, which is Tylenol. And if you're feeling ill, extremely ill, then you should go seek medical attention.
I've got one more question. What are you most concerned about? What are you most fearful about?
Yeah, I'm most fearful about, and I don't think it's that likely, in that there is widespread local transmission, and we have people that are coming seeking care, critically ill, and it overwhelms our health system. I do think, though, that we're prepared for it.
Dr. Matthew Waxman, I feel a little better after talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
Now that Joe Biden has won South Carolina by a healthy margin, will people listen more to one very specific argument that he's making against Bernie Sanders? Stay right here for that.
The trick is, which candidate can reach out and bring new people into the political process, who can create the excitement and the energy for young people to come in? I think that's our campaign.
Well, look, if he's a nominee, I will support him, but I think it makes it very difficult down ballot, and this is no great secret to anybody. You can't run as an independent socialist, now a democratic socialist, and do particularly expect to do very well in states we have to win, like North Carolina, like Georgia, like Florida, like Texas, like Pennsylvania, etc.
Former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders both making their cases for the Democratic nomination and what it's going to take to win the general election. Joining me now, James Pindall, political reporter at the Boston Globe, and Seema Mehta, political reporter at the Los Angeles Times. So welcome to you both. James, you first here. Will Biden's comments resonate more with the public now that he's come off this huge win in South Carolina?
Well, I think a lot of the public could obviously take his advice, but they're not sure exactly which candidate that advice applies to. Clearly, obviously, Joe Biden had a very big night in South Carolina. He is now allowed to continue. Though, of course, it might be even harder now to stop Bernie Sanders, particularly heading into Super Tuesday, if you have a lot of moderates basically duking it out almost will they get delegates in this state, but not in this other state because Bloomberg is better over there. The math obviously gets very complicated, but if you're Joe Biden, you're very happy today.
Yeah, I want to look at some of the numbers here because Biden, as we know, cautiously celebrated the victory in South Carolina. He's acknowledged he's still got a fair long ways to go. But this new NBC News Marist poll shows that Sanders has the edge in Texas, also tied with Biden in North Carolina. These two states award a combined 338 delegates on Super Tuesday. And I do want to make the point that this poll was taken before the big win in South Carolina for Biden. So, as you take that big win, what are the prospects for him going into Super Tuesday? Does he have some headwind that he can ride? James, sorry.
Oh, you were going with me. He does obviously have headwind. I mean, clearly, if you look at the map on Tuesday, the states you're going to be looking at for sort of a Biden bump would be a place like Virginia, would be a place like Alabama, where he's already sort of having a lead, though there's been that fewer polls. Arkansas clearly is a spot, but North Carolina is obviously a place where he'll be looking. But you mentioned those combined states of having 300-some delegates. We've got to talk about California with 416 delegates, and that's obviously where only two candidates right now are above the threshold.
Yeah, no,
and Joe Biden is not one of them.
Yeah, well, he's got to hit 15% to get anything out of the state of California. Seema, as I bring you into the conversation here, with regard to Biden and his advertising, I mean, look, I've been here a couple of days now, and let me tell you, I've seen nothing but advertising.
Absolutely.
I've not seen one Biden ad.
No, and he has. I mean, they talked, I think, last week about doing a six-figure ad buy in the Super Tuesday state.
Lots of digital.
Six figures is nothing. I mean, that's like, you know, a day in LA. I mean, like, seriously, I mean, we have some of the most expensive media markets in the country: San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. So I mean, to have like a really substantive presence on the air, you have to spend millions and millions of dollars, and it doesn't look like he has.
So how does that translate into lack of votes?
And that's what we've seen in the polls. I mean, he's not hitting the 15% threshold that he needs to get delegates. I mean, he certainly has some. He's in a better spot today than he was yesterday.
Yeah.
You know, he's on the news. He's had a victory. This argument about electability that he's been making all along, he can now point to a state where it's worked. But it's still really, really tough for him in the state.
What about what we heard from Biden earlier about his down ballot concerns? How much is he on point with that?
I mean, when you talk to Democratic strategists, and frankly, these are the people who are most skeptical of Bernie Sanders, they do bring that up, especially in places like Orange County, which elected, you know, a bunch of new Democratic members of Congress. But these are not, you know, from the Bernie Sanders camp. I mean, these are fairly moderate, you know, members, and these are one-time Republican districts.
Exactly.
You know, these are not like, so, you know, this is not Berkeley or something. So I think that, you know, in those areas, in particular, these suburban areas that are turning from red to blue, I think that, you know, a number of Democrats have concerns about what he will do if he's at the top of the ticket.
The area of the state that is predominantly stayed in Republican hands is really that central part of California, right? The Visalia, Bakersfield, Fresno, that whole heart.
It started to trend a little bit blue.
Purpley.
Yeah, but then it's definitely in play, and I think that's another area where people have concerns about if Bernie Sanders is at the top of the ticket. But he's also arguing, he's actually had a big operation in the Central Valley, and he's really courting Latinos, young people there, and I think he's probably spent the most time there of any candidate, of any of the Democrats. So, I mean, he's making a play for those areas.
Yeah, for sure. James, with regard to the coronavirus, I know that you've written that this could be the most important issue of the 2020 election. Give me the reasons why you feel that way, and is there a candidate who benefits if coronavirus is a big play in this election?
Well, it's certainly the X factor, and you saw it play out this week, and you'll obviously see it play out tonight when Mike Bloomberg holds a 3-minute kind of infomercial on this one issue across networks tonight. But I think the real big X factor here is, I mean, look, this could be great for Donald Trump in terms of he's able to show competency if this does not blow up. He could say that he saved the economy, saved people's lives, everything else, or this could go horribly bad. In terms of the Democratic primary, I'm not sure we know where this is going. In terms of Democratic candidates maybe wanting someone with a plan, like Elizabeth Warren's, a steady hand like Joe Biden, or suddenly, when we're in a major crisis in a pandemic, maybe Medicare for All doesn't seem so crazy. You know, one more thing about the Joe Biden bump into Super Tuesday is he's really unfortunate in terms of the calendar. You know, he was named the winner, and then 48 hours later, we're going to be voting on Super Tuesday. That is not enough time to get the massive money to even buy the ads. Remember, there are 11 days between New Hampshire and Nevada, for example. This is 48 hours. This is going to be very difficult here for him to pull off.
Okay. James Spindle and Seema Mehta, you guys pulled it off with this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Remembering a march that changed history and the role it is playing in the race for president, next. Right now, Sunday services are underway in Selma, Alabama, before the start of the 55th Bridge Crossing Jubilee. That's going to be across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The event is commemorating Bloody Sunday, when in 1965, hundreds of people peacefully protesting for voting rights were beaten and arrested by state troopers. NBC's Blaine Alexander is there for us on this significant Sunday. Blaine, with a welcome to you. Who all is there?
Well, Alex, good morning to you from Selma, Alabama. Certainly a lot of people. In fact, if you can look at the screen here behind me, this is kind of a telecast of what's going on inside Brown Chapel AME. There are plenty of people who couldn't make it inside, so they're watching outside. Right now, we're listening to Senator Doug Jones speak. He is coming up after former Mayor Mike Bloomberg just finished his remarks inside the church. And just about 15 minutes ago or so, we saw former Vice President Joe Biden be escorted inside the church. So it's certainly not an exaggeration to say this is almost a who's who of politics here today, and the correlation cannot be lost, considering we're here celebrating the 55th anniversary of the city, of the movement that really has become almost synonymous with African-American fight for voting rights in this country, and we're sitting here just about 2 days ahead of Super Tuesday. In fact, Alabama itself is a Super Tuesday state. So you see all of these people, all of the people who have kind of come out, they've celebrated. This is a tradition that happens year after year. They kind of reenact that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a service that so many people come to inside Brown Chapel AME. But what we're certainly seeing more of is organizers focusing on the 2020 election. In fact, the theme itself is Lift Our Voice 2020, Lift Our Vote, rather, 2020. So organizers are hoping that this will inspire more people to go out and exercise their vote on Tuesday. Now, Alex, we were actually speaking with some people who came, and one of them happened to be somebody who was actually part of that march back in 1965. He said that even though decades have passed, he says that he's actually disappointed that he hasn't seen more change since that time. Take a look at what he has to say.
I look around Selma, I see the projects full of black folk. I see the elected officials full of white folk. I see the people who own the government, not the government, people who own stuff are white. Nothing's changed, not a lot has changed in that sense. We got black elected officials, that's good. But the populace still, lots of them are still poor.
And so, Alex, back out here live in Selma, we do know that this is something that, again, organizers are hoping will improve voter turnout on Tuesday. They say that because this is something that really is galvanizing people, they're talking about, voter rights inside. In fact, we had someone come and speak on behalf of Congressman John Lewis, saying that the best way they can honor him at this time is to turn out and vote on Tuesday, Alex.
Absolutely, and see what happens with those 52 delegates here in the state of Alabama. Blaine Alexander, thank you so much for that live report. An American patient who contracted coronavirus while on a cruise ship says he has the virus, and so far, he says it hasn't been that bad. Joining me now is that writer and patient, Carl Goldman. Carl, I want to tell everyone, first of all, with my thanks to you for being here, that you are a heck of a writer, and I suggest that everybody go to the Washington Post and read what you have written about your personal experience. It is the slug for anybody looking for the title. I have the coronavirus. So far, it hasn't been that bad for me. It's well written. It's clear that you are a guy from radio. I know that you run the KHTS radio there in Santa Clarita. So you're here because you're able to talk to me, Carl. You're feeling pretty good. You've still got a cough, right? How about your fever? Where does that stand?
Fever is gone. It's been gone for almost 2 weeks. Like it seems everyone else who gets this, the common denominator seems to be a high fever very, very quickly. In my case, I did not know I had the virus when we boarded the plane from the Diamond Princess back to the States. Went to sleep for 2 hours, woke up, high fever, over 103, and then that's when they put me in a quarantine area on the plane, and then later I ended up in Omaha in the biocontainment area. The fever only lasted about 8-9 hours and then disappeared. The cough still lingers. That was 2 weeks ago when we landed here in Omaha. And since then, 2 days ago, I was moved and downgraded from the biocontainment area to another quarantine area here in Omaha. We have 15 of us here, 13 of the virus. My wife, luckily, does not. She gets to leave tomorrow. I, unfortunately, Alex, tested again yesterday, and I'm still positive with the virus.
Okay. So you've been there for 2 weeks. I know you took off on that cruise sometime in January, had no idea that you were going to be quarantined, sequestered, however you want to identify it, until now March. But here we are. When that fever hit you and that little cough that you had on that plane, how hard was the punch? Did you immediately think, uh-oh?
Yeah, I realized by then, this is it. I following the same symptoms as everyone else. There were 300. By then, there were already 300 victims of the virus on board the Diamond Princess. So the common denominator was already there. When my fever spiked, I was pretty sure I had the virus. It wasn't until I got to Omaha the next morning that it was confirmed after running tests here in the biocontainment center.
Hey, Carl, how badly have you felt? I mean, I'm sure you've had colds before, flu before in your life, potentially. How badly does this compare?
Yeah, I have been writing a daily blog, just in the Washington Post story. I've been writing a daily blog on hometownstation.com, our website here over in California. And I compare it, and I do that in today's blog. On a 1 to 10, I'm about a 2. That's it. I've had tiredness, which would have been an 8, but there's no sneezing, no sniffling, no stuffy nose, no body ache, no sweat, no chills. So it's a very, for me, it was a very mild case of what would be a cold.
Yeah. Have doctors been able to tell you their best guesstimate as to how long you have to stay where you are? How long until you're rid of the virus?
Boy, it's up to my body. Once I test negative, I will have to test negative 3 days in a row. They do a swab test that goes up both nostrils and down the throat. All 3 of those have to come out negative, and all 3 of those need to be negative 3 days in a row, 3 24-hour periods apart. I was tested yesterday, and all 3 were positive. They now will not test me again until tomorrow. So Monday will be the first day that the clock can start ticking for me to get released here, if I'm lucky.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're awfully lucky, Carl Goldman, to have spoken with you. I want to thank you so much, and again, reiterate that folks can go to that blog that you've been writing, but also the way you wrote this in the Washington Post, it's terrific. And like you aptly say, your experience has been something like out of the Andromeda strain. Really extraordinary color that you write about, but we're glad that you're doing so well, Carl, and continued success and best of luck. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks, Alex. You take care.